Click for IB Biology. We're still looking at the cell membrane structure, and we're with lipid bilayers. And now we're starting to look at the role of proteins in those bilayers. And here we will look at the idea of an integral and a peripheral protein. There's a blank version of this presentation down in the description down below. There's a questions there. There's a 10-question quiz with answers for you to test your understanding of this concept. So in 1925, it had been established that the phospholipids were part of the cell membrane, and the proposal of Gorton and Grendel was of the lipid bilayer as shown here, but it was known that there were proteins involved in the membrane. Today we understand that those proteins are involved in two different ways. In this illustration here, I'm looking at the peripheral proteins. So these are peripheral. Now, peripheral is to be on the outside. When we say we're on the outside, we mean outside of the membrane, which means we can be positioned in here or on this side here. Many diagrams show peripheral proteins as sitting above the phosphate heads, and that's quite reasonable. That is the case, but it is actually reasonable, also equally reasonable, to show that the peripheral proteins are interacting, albeit loosely, with the phosphates in these locations here. Some of the functions of these proteins is that they are involved in cells communicating with each other, called cell signaling. We'll see examples later in this course. They can act as enzymes. So this is an interesting idea, that the enzyme is located on the membrane, and so therefore it's static, and the name given to this is immobilized. An immobilized enzyme, some of which we can find in our digestive system. So immobilized enzymes can be peripheral proteins on membranes. Cell adhesion, this is the idea in multicellular organisms that cells need to stay attached to each other, and that can be one of the functions of the peripheral proteins as well. Cytoskeletal organization, so if we have the cell like this, we know that within the cell there are protein molecules which strand across the cell, connecting together to create the shape of the cell. So think of cell shape for this. And they attach to the peripheral proteins as a way of anchoring themselves. So these cytoskeletal protein molecules might anchor themselves in this way, holding the membrane into a particular shape. Membrane trafficking relates to the idea of playing a role in molecules being able to go across the membrane, although not directly participating in that. Examples in the course as well. Ion channel regulation is another feature of this, so that where we do have integral proteins, we'll look at that in a moment, that they need to interact with peripheral proteins for their regulation. And then I've just mentioned scaffolding and anchoring, which is another related feature to the skeletal cell organization, but also to anchoring molecules in close proximity to the cell membrane, both internally and externally. Peripheral proteins. Integral proteins will play a large part in our study of the cell membrane. Here we take an overview of their location. So we have the phospholipid layer here. You've got the polar heads and the hydrophilic non-polar fatty acid chains in the center. Now the peripheral protein, remember that this is a three-dimensional structure, sits entirely across the phospholipid layer. So it transitions from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. Now in order to achieve that, the amino acids that make up this protein in this region here and in this region here, the fatty acids, their R groups need to be polar charged so that they can merge with the hydrophilic nature of the phosphate heads. However, in the part of the protein which is in this region here, so the central region, notice that that overlaps, coincides with the lipid tails here, then the amino acids in this region, they would need to be non-polar. So in the entire structure of this protein, there will need to be both hydrophilic and hydrophobic amino acids so that it can sit in the membrane and not be repelled. Now, these integral proteins play many roles in cell function and form a large part of our understanding of how the cell membrane operates. And we will see some examples of that in the next video, which is on the movement of water across the cell membrane in an aquaporin integral protein, and then subsequent videos will look at ion channels. There's the link to the next video, there's the link to the channel, and there's the link to all the videos in this particular playlist for this particular topic.